The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Wait, Tylor, I know what that means now.
Yeah, no, you really don't. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, your host, who honestly really liked these chapters this week, even though not a ton happened plot-wise. And I am joined by Greg, who might fight me on that evaluation of the chapter. Greg, how did you feel about the reading this week?
Wheel in the time keeps on turning. Who knows where I'll be tomorrow? They were fine.
Don't get that one either.
You need to have parents that listen to old radio stations, oldies radio stations when you were young. I'm good. These were fine. I don't know that I would list these as my favorite chapters, but we of course are obliquely referencing the fact that we read chapter 36, Misdirections, and chapter 37, Imre Stand. How'd I do on pronunciation?
I say Imre, but I have no reason to believe that mine is more accurate than yours. These were two chapters where I felt like you could either walk away and go, or you could walk away and go, there's a lot new here. I just don't have the ability to put any of it together. I know we're talking obliquely. Give me like one or two more sentences, and then we can dive into gasp, ill-advised discussion for a second week in a row.
Let's say, I would say the second felt more like what you just said. It's like, oh, I'm seeing some new puzzle pieces that feel a little important, and there's something going on here I can't quite put my finger on. Some kind of like trouble that's ghostly, or like a phantom menace, if you will. But I couldn't necessarily say that about the first one. The first one, I've been doing my new strategy where I read the chapter kind of in a sitting and then sit down to write my notes. And I was like, okay, they walked a bunch. And so not a lot there, but I'm ready for you to enlighten me. But before we do that, we are going to dive into an ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast, which is focused on the old school cover for, I assume, the original hardcover and the original paperback of The Shadow Rising. And as we're saying this now out loud, I think I'm realizing I didn't put up the image for last week, but maybe that's okay because we're still in the future.
Yep, you got 2 days.
Woo! Okay. So we'll do that. I will stop just posting pictures of my coffee cup while I read the book. And instead, we'll have posted last week's image, which was the ebook cover. And then as you are listening to us right now, I will have definitely posted the image of this week's hardcover to our Instagram account, and hey, maybe our Threads, which so far I think has 2 followers. We're banging on Threads. We're just getting crazy. So we'll get those images in the right place. Or my dear friends and listeners, you can do a quick Google to catch up on the poor social media management of this podcast.
So this image, I believe it's Daryl K. Sweet, if I'm recalling correctly, although yell at me if that is incorrect, is an image that depicts the Aiel Waste. So we have these crazy red columns of stone kind of jutting up everywhere. It's clear that the characters are kind of on a ridge that doesn't clearly connect to all of the land below it. And our characters are in front of what appears to be a wagon, maybe the peddler's wagon that we meet in these 2 chapters. And there is a fire in front of which what appears to be, I would assume, Rand, Matt, and Moraine seem to be kind of gathered, maybe smoking pipes and cooking. And there are also two people in dark brown who are guiding what look like pack horses. Their garb makes them look like Aiel, but I immediately go, wait a minute, the only Aiel who handle horses are Guy Shane, and they don't look like that. So I'm slightly baffled at who the people leading the horses are meant to be. But this is a beautiful image that I think gives me the Aiel waste in a way that I wouldn't have gotten, even though there's a pretty detailed description of the geography in this chapter. What do you think about this image?
Well, I was only slightly distracted because the way we do this is you text me the images, and I clicked too long on one of the people trying to zoom in, and it created a sticker. So from now on, when I'm texting you, expect a sticker of the people on the front cover of this book. Um, this is a little unexpected in a couple ways. I think in my head, I've been going more Lawrence of Arabia in terms of the
Mm,
desert as I pictured the Aiel waste, correct or incorrect. I've been thinking more sandy desert than I have rocky
mhm.
chasms desert, or in this case, I don't even know what you call these formations, these tall standing rocks.
The
Um,
breaking of the world.
and then the actual like set of characters, as has been the case, feels a little more European fantasy than I might imagine. Now,
Yeah.
the wagon is clearly much more inspired by like the Roma tradition in Europe than it
Uh-huh.
is like an American covered wagon. But something about the way the covering is and the way they're posed, it just kind of feels very Oregon Trail to me.
Totally.
And that's the age I am. I'm not
I can
yeah,
relate
anyway.
to that.
So it feels a little more kind of old fashioned than I think I
Uh-huh.
have pictured it in my head, because I go more probably more towards the show aesthetics, which I would be surprised. I'd be surprised if the landscape looked like this, and I'd be very surprised if kind of it looked as old fashioned when we get to this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that is the oddity of this cover is in general I look at them and I think like, "Oh, this looks like kind of a standard like sword and sorcery kind of cover." And this one almost reads like Western to me, just with a very odd backdrop to it. And especially Moraine, there's something very odd about how like domestic she looks. It almost looks like
Mm.
this is like a tracing of like you said, like an Oregon Trail kind of painting that then was adjusted to something else and they gave her Moraine's blue dress. But that's really my only objection. I think it's kind of a beautiful cover. There's just some like anachronisms between what's in the book and the way that it's portrayed, which is kind of always the case with these older covers. Any last kind of thoughts or impressions about this cover? I think it's beautiful, but I don't have much to add beyond that.
I'll just to the subject of how beautiful it is. I'll just add the sky and the sunset, right?
Mm,
Like it's very lovely that that's the hour they chose, and like you're saying, it is perhaps a little too domestic for what we've been picturing, but it has this kind of nice balance where you get the very kind of small characters in both a giant expanse of the landscape and of the sky and so on. So the balance of it works really nice. And I'm picturing kind of how this would wrap around the spine. And
uh,
that would put, I assume most of the characters squarely on the front, maybe this horse and guide kind of wrapping around the
yeah.
edge. And then the back cover would be pure landscape. And like that works well. And as silly as it seems, that's something I miss about modern covers.
Mm,
Very few covers do the wraparound thing. My wife, as I think I've said before, maybe she's changed jobs since I last mentioned it, but she sells books for a major publisher, and so I joke with her all the time because she gets these like stacks of like 40 different new books, and all the covers are like they go through phases. It's like
yeah.
generic bright color at the moment is the kind of it cover, and it works through genres in some ways too. It's not always the same, but especially like just your mainstream fiction always is kind of samey, and so like I miss something like this that would really stand out and be very different.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I've always had like a real soft spot in my heart for these covers, and then I always look at them and I'm like, is that the characters? Let's not think about it too hard. Like squint and move on. I think that we have way too much summarizing for me to do today, so I suggest we get on to the summarizing, beginning with chapter 36, Misdirections. And I'm not going to say too much about it, but do peep that chapter icon. It is not what I would have expected for this chapter. The Aiel leave early in the morning, and Rand observes that they are kind of all of the broken landscape, and he thinks about how the breaking of the world may have created that. He thinks about how the heat is oppressive and all of the things he's doing to try to keep himself cool. And he also realizes that the Shido left at basically the same time that the Jindo, who he is traveling with, did. And the wise ones are basically separating them and seem to be the only reason that the two groups haven't come to blows. The Aiel seem to really struggle explaining their customs and why they are doing the things they are. And so Rand is often kind of baffled. And he observes Moraine and the wise ones talking quite frequently. And Rand thinks that Egwene is really the only person who he potentially could trust, but then he worries whether she could even be someone he could trust at all. At this point, Aviendha, who now basically follows him everywhere, jumps in and says that Elaine is the woman for him. He basically assumes that Aviendha is spying for the wise ones, and then she starts explaining how wonderful Elaine is, even going to a very detailed physical description. Aviendha says that Elaine probably should have arranged to have Rand see her in the bath, but since she hasn't, she can take over and explain this. Rand tries to change the subject, but Aviendha brings up the letters that Elaine sent, and Rand thinks that the two letters contradicted one another, and so they can't both be true. He also realizes that basically all of the women, including Egwene and Aviendha, all know about those letters. And then he thinks about how things were simpler when he was with Min, and he kind of thinks about that in a really positive light. After that, he's silent, and and Aviendha kind of sulks as a result of it, saying that she is listening because that's all that he wants, and Rand is baffled. We then switch into Mat's POV. He tries to ignore Rand and Aviendha, and it's noted that he refused healing from Moraine when she arrived the previous night. He thinks that now he's been to Rhuidean, he has kind of fulfilled all of the things he needed to do according to the snakes and foxes, and he can leave any time, but he wouldn't survive in the desert, so he starts looking for an alternate way out. He notes Dorinda, who is a maiden who played the Maiden's Kiss with him, returns and reports peddlers ahead. All of the Aiel speed up and eventually find the peddlers' wagons. Mat mentions that the peddlers, gleeman, and the traveling people are allowed to travel through the waste, but Rand warns him that he probably shouldn't talk too much about the Tinkers because it's a sore spot with the Aiel. Rand kind of cryptically wonders out loud whether he will leave the waste, seeming to refer to someone else. And then Rand, Ruark, and Couladin all are able to approach the peddler. He introduces himself as Hadnan Kadir. Ruark asks whether how he has no guide, despite the fact that he's this deep in the waste. And he basically reveals that if he had continued going that way, there would have been dire consequences had he arrived at Rhuidean without any kind of one to stop him. There is a brief dispute about which group the peddlers will travel with. Couladin saying that since he is the largest group, the Shido should host them. But Ruark very quickly shuts him down, saying that he is not a clan chief, and so the peddlers will travel with them. Mat immediately announces that he is going to buy the wide-brimmed hat that Kadir has, and when he says this, another person, Kiel, a relatively kind of robust woman with an interesting voice, according to Mat, accepts that and then seems to kind of take over and kind of once she learns the plan from Kadir, she kind of gives orders to everyone, including seemingly the person who is in charge. And Mat notices that there is a gleeman with the wagons. Mat comments on the strange group and also the argument about who is escorting them. Aviendha kind of corrects him and says that that argument was not about Giato. Instead, it was about Couladin acting like a clan chief when he isn't one. Rand says that Kadir had dangerous eyes, and Rand talks about snares and lost time. He says that they ride with evil now. And when Mat kind of questions him about that, he says that many are watching him, including Lanfear. And Mat thinks he needs to get away because he is worried that Rand may already be going mad. That's a lot. And it's one of those chapters where I think if we look for character moments, we have a bunch of interesting hints here, but maybe not enough things to really qualify as moments in and of themselves. What were your takeaways from this chapter, which is a little bit all over the place in my estimation? A lot of little things happen, but not any one big thing.
And I think that fits the theme for the night, where you split both of these chapters. And so I found myself wondering, why isn't there just a Rand chapter and then a Matt
Mm.
chapter, and we kind of get a piece of each of them in each of these? Sorry for people who are just listening to the first one without reading the second one yet. Um, it's an interesting set of encounters, and I was kind of thinking, where did my struggle come from? And I think I'm still wrapping my head around Aiel vocabulary.
Mhm.
So I want to make sure we have this correct for anybody who's struggling a little like me, because again, when you take weeks off in between, I think this actually hurts in some ways.
Yeah.
So we have Rand, who is he who comes with the dawn. I got
Yep.
that much correctly, and I pronounced every one of those words correctly. That'd be funny if you were like, it's actually Dawan. But
I
so
I do think that you could potentially pronounce one of the characters in these chapters' name as Kelly, and I'm not convinced it's not that.
so Rand is still being largely accepted by the group that is led by Ruark. Ruark is the
Correct.
clan chief of the clan Shido.
No, Shido are the others.
No.
Those are the ones with Cooladin.
Okay. Well, now you skipped like three of my lessons. So then Cooladin and the Shido left first, or separated
That
clearly, and
so
now we've kind of folded back together.
so yeah, so it seems like the Shido are almost like shadowing the other
Okay.
Aiel. Like they left early in the morning and the Shido kind of packed up as quickly as they could to be able to match them.
Okay. And Ruark's tribe is the
So this is where I am slightly lost in the vocabulary, and I want to make sure that I am not mixing things up. So there are two things that are generally associated with Aiel. So there is a clan, which is kind of, think of it as like a nation almost, or like, kind of an overarching group that is ruled by a clan chief. And then there are septs, which are things like the Maidens of the Spear or like the Stone Dogs. And there are, say, Stone Dogs in every group uh,
okay.
of every clan of the Aiel. So the two phrases that are getting thrown around, there are the Hardad Aiel and there are the Jindo Aiel. And the thing that I am slightly, I think I was assuming that his clan was Tardad. This is going to be a Google I can quickly do, but it's possible the clan was Jindo and the sept was Tardad. But those are the vocabulary terms we should be associating with Ruark.
Okay. And I think I was leaning towards Jindo, not with any expertise, but just because I was thinking of the two groups as Shido and Jindo, because they're
Okay,
kind of
yeah.
similar in structure and so on. We'll see what your Google says. This is good content for a podcast.
I was hoping you would talk just a little bit longer, sir.
I think that it's a real moment where let's call it stumped the expert, that I have asked such a deep, insightful question of this material that we've made Tylor, the person who the intro to this podcast says knows everything about
Ah,
Wheel of Time, find something he doesn't
that
quite know.
there are two septs with Ruark because remember he is leading the group that went across the spine of the world, which was not all of one sept. So Ruark is the leader of the Tardad, but the Jindo are another clan where there are at least 100 of them traveling with Ruark's group. That is where
Okay.
that confusion came from.
Okay. So Hardon Jinto working with Ruark and now with Rand, headed to, in this case, an oasis
Yep.
called Imre Stand that is on the way to say the
Cold
name of the
Rock's Hold.
Cold Rock's Hold, which is where they will have the big conclave.
I, I gave you the big town on the way to Oregon
Oh.
Trail is Cold Rock's Hold. The Oregon Trail, the end of the trail they are going to is Alcair Dal, which is where they will have the meeting.
Okay. Okay. And so we should, whenever Paladin is mentioned and the Shinto,
Shido.
it's Shido. It means that they are not, it's an uneasy relationship, maybe not outright hostility,
Yeah.
but in particular, Kaladin does not believe in this prophecy or that Rand is fulfilling the prophecy, is probably more accurate.
Exactly. Yeah, they believe that since he is not of the Aiel, that he basically can't be he who comes with the dawn.
Okay. And then we have then I would say so once I wrap my head around that, I'll get back to your initial question, which is what of the character stuff is more interesting here. And I'm gonna answer with my I'm most interested in it and least interested in it, which is the
Yep.
same thing, which
Yep.
is I am most interested in Avienda's new relationship with Rand. And
Mhm.
this goes back to a comment you made last episode, which is Avienda was changed by what she saw. And so watching her be so weird around
Yeah.
Rand makes me very interested in what she potentially saw and unraveling that mystery.
This was something I was unsure if I was going to bring up on my own. So the fact that you have brought up most of it gives me the confidence to bring up the one other thing. You said she was changed by what she saw. Just a reminder, because I think this can get lost in what Rand saw. She did not see the same thing, right? The women
Right.
went through a different ter'angreal that let them live different versions of their lives over and over again. And now they
Mm.
have kind of a vague memory of key moments in their life. So something that she either knows is going to happen or could happen seems to be driving this, as you said, kind of new relationship with Rand.
And then sounds great. And then the least interesting part of that is I do not care about Elaine and Rand.
Yeah.
Like whatever their interaction was, is the two letters I don't understand and I just don't care. And it comes up in both chapters as a like, hey, remember.
Yeah.
So how I'm interpreting the package of those two things is Rand doesn't care about Elaine. He doesn't feel driven to her. And yet whatever it is that Avienda saw, the like, she's gone back in time to kill baby Hitler. And the kill baby Hitler moment is to pretend that, or sorry, it's not to pretend, but is to make sure that Rand ends up tied to Elaine, right?
Yep.
I I mean, why did I just go to kill baby Hitler? It's Back to the Future, almost
You're not
exactly,
wrong.
right?
Yeah.
It's like let's make sure Lorraine and George get together. And I find that compelling, but at the same time, I think Elaine has remained such a kind of I don't care that much character for me
Yeah.
still that I
Yeah.
just don't get it.
Elaine and Rand, I think, are the perfect example of my problem with Robert Jordan and romance, which is that they had two really great scenes together at the beginning of this book. And now I am supposed to care for however long they are apart, that they have
Mm.
a strong relationship that they could potentially build on. And it's two letters we don't get to read that seemingly contradict each other. That is the entirety of this plot line, right? I am very interested in the Avienda side of this. And in particular, I want to kind of pick apart that motivation, right? You're thinking like what she saw is like those two need to be together in some way, but there's also like an anger to it that at least makes me think there was something either personal or odd or not just they need to be together, but there's something that one of them could have done that caused that stronger emotion, right? And so that's the mystery to me that this plants that I'm very interested in. I just don't know whether we have too many pieces here other than figuring out where she's at emotionally. But in terms of what she saw or why she's doing it, we're pretty sparse on clues. Any last thoughts on that kind of? It's an interesting scene. I guess my only last note on it is Rand's response is to kind of run away to the shelter of someone who he thinks of as kind of like less fraught in his relationship with
Mm.
them, and that is Min, which is a little bit of a surprise to me. They haven't interacted in quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing feels very high school. But
Yeah,
like I'll go to the girl who was kindest to me. But it is very interesting that it is Min and not Egwene.
yeah,
Rand Egwene seems to be over, right? I
yeah,
don't what do you call those shippers? Randwains? They're not seemingly kept in play. And the
yeah,
fact, we did get that hint. I think that was all the way back at the end of book 2 that he was with Min and it
yeah.
was like he could have gone with any of the three of them, but it doesn't seem like Egwene is part of that equation now.
Yeah, I think that the beginning of this book is when Egwene and Elaine had like the handing off Rand moment. And I feel like since then, there is just like, no, it is over. We will not mention the fact that they once had any sort of romantic connection to one another, right? Rand at this point, even in this chapter, is like doubtful whether he can even trust Egwene, much less that, they have any sort of strong relationship anymore. Um, I think Avienda is the interesting part of this Rand section, right? She's a little bit of a mystery, and you know how I am about characters who are mysteries. Um,
Mm.
Matt, on the other hand, oh man, the second Matt chapter is just so much better than this one. I just kind of want to talk about that one a bit. Um, we do get some new characters here, right? And anytime that happens, especially when they get a relatively showy entrance like this, I feel like that is a moment where I need to take a back seat and say, what was your impression of these characters? Because I don't want to tip my hand about which ones seem important or what moments are the important ones for figuring out where we're at.
Um, I'm just gonna not beat around the bush at all. Is I thought the fact that I mean this goes back to God, first season of this show where I referenced the Lord of the Rings moment with Strider, and it would
Mm,
a real villain would seem fair but be fouler, or I've
yeah,
bastardized the line again, but um, I think that there's something up with these peddlers. The cover story is not adding up, and so you have a pair of them, and I think they make it seem like the man is trouble and the woman is just fine. So I suspect the man is just fine and the woman is trouble, is kind of
yeah,
where I landed on this kind of brief interaction. And, I think they signal very clearly that we should not trust these characters. So it's not
yeah,
like I'm going far out on a limb with that piece of it, but to kind of I mean they might just both be evil or something, but
yeah,
everything about them isn't adding up. And so because they make such a big deal about how the man seems kind of screwy and the woman seems very kind, I'm like, oh
yeah.
nope, it's the opposite. So
I,
I think I just short circuited like what could have
no,
been like a 10-minute conversation about it, but
No, not at all. I think that is about the level of impression that we get of those characters at this point. I have a couple of very small notes here. Number one, Matt gets his hat, which means that we now have the full ensemble. Last week, we
Mm.
did the ill-advised discussion about what Matt looked like. And the entire time, I was like, this is 1 week too early. He just needs the hat. That's what he is in every one of the images. So if you look up fan art online and see Matt with like a big, crazy green, like almost cowboyish sort of hat, boy, oh boy, is that what he bought in this chapter.
Well, let me say, and this is a tangent, I am playing Baldur's Gate 3, and I'm very bad at this type of video game. And so I am not good about like going into your character and really reworking your inventory. And this
Mhm.
is just how I play all video games, is I like in the generic starter outfit until like the last act when I can't beat a character. And then I finally put on the armor I've been carrying around for, 200 hours. But I will say, when I was playing around with the character outfit one time, I accidentally put on a big floppy hat and I could not figure out how to take it off.
Yep.
So my character remains like the basic level, except I've customized it with a big floppy hat. So I appreciated this. I'm like, oh, it's just like my Baldur's Gate character. I have a big floppy hat.
For what it's worth, Baldur's Gate is an incredible dress up game, if that's really what you're looking for. The other kind of note that I had here is you mentioned kind of the vibe is that we are not supposed to trust these characters. That comes straight from Rand. And I think it is deliberate that we are not in his head when he says it, right? Because we don't get to
Mm,
see his motivation, know why he doesn't distrust those characters. And we also get Matt being able to wonder how much of it is madness, which is a question that we normally don't have when we're in Rand's head, but we seem to
mm,
increasingly have when we're out of his head. So I'm curious where you are at on Madness Watch, right? So far, this is a thing that Matt has repeatedly kind of thrown at us, and we know he is not the most reliable narrator. But if Matt's thinking it, everyone else is at least subconsciously thinking it. So what's your take on kind of where Rand is at the end of this chapter? Because he seems to not have the opinion you do about Kadir. He seems to think he is bad news.
mm. Um, I kind of interpret it as, I mean, I was gonna say stereotyping, but it's a more genuine form of stereotyping because that is just a law in this universe that the men who can channel go mad. But
Yeah.
it just feels like they are all expecting him to go mad, so that's what they're seeing. But I don't know. When we're in Rand's head, I don't feel that madness. And so I appreciate the point you're making that we switch out of it for this kind of hint. So it's a little more ambiguous and we can question it more. But I still land on the place of like, I think Rand's got it together. And if when he moves deliberately,
Yeah.
it usually ends up working out. So I think that's where I'm sitting.
Cool. No, I absolutely buy that. Any last thoughts on this chapter before I think we get into something where I would have said like five more things about the current chapter, but I want to say them when we have more in like 5 minutes.
Let's just the only other thing in my notes, these are peddlers, not tinkers.
Correct.
And they say don't mention the tinkers, and that's part of the history we learned in
That's correct.
Rudion.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to make sure I had it right. We should, I mean, don't put him in the actual Pad and Fane category, but the category that Pad
Yeah,
and Fane was in. Yeah.
exactly.
All right. Take us into chapter 37, Imre Stand.
Chapter 37, Imre and or Imre Stand. Rand asks why they are stopping so early in the day, and Aviendha tells him that there is water at Imre Stand, and that is the best place to stop. Ruark notes that the peddlers also need to stop once it starts getting dark because the land in the waste is so difficult for wagons to get around. Rand has noticed that Aviendha seems to hate him, and Rand thinks of the wise ones in Moraine cooperating and kind of worries about what that means. He thinks that Egwene is the only one he can trust, and this is the moment where he really doubts whether or not she is someone that he can trust. Aviendha says that the waste would potentially break him if he didn't have guidance because she says that it would be just because of the way that he's treated Elaine. He asks if she will respect the Karakarn, and Ruark then says that a chief is not the same as a king, and that they do not get the same sort of deference that he is used to. The maidens approach, treating Aviendha seemingly with sympathy, and they report that no one is to be seen at Imre Stand. The wise ones seem to be aware of this and seem kind of frustrated by it. And Aviendha says that it's most likely a raid for livestock. And she seems frustrated that they couldn't go to recover the lost herds, but it's noted that Rand thinks it's odd she doesn't think of the hostages, although they are Gaishane, and so that is why the Aiel wouldn't think of potentially recovering them. They hurry forward with Rand struggling to ride while he is apparently holding Saidin, and Matt hesitates but eventually follows. Imre Stand is a very small, but the goats are there, so it apparently was not a raid. They say that the herd has been wandering for a few days, and they see that the small shelters the doors are broken. Once they go inside, there is blood everywhere, and Matt says it looks like it was Trollocs. Rand then dismisses his sword, and word spreads among the Aiel, who apparently are very twitchy and worried about an attack. Kadir brings with him into the area a beautiful dark-haired woman. She sees the blood inside, but seems to have an oddly short reaction, almost as if she dismisses it quickly. And as she kind of walks around, she comes to talk to Rand. She says she thought he would be more handsome. Her name is Isendre, and Kadir implies that he knows Rand is the Dragon Reborn, and he says, but Rand replies not to believe everything you hear. He says he would like to speak again, and then the peddler is off following Isendre. Aviendha thinks he was staring at Isendre and says he belongs to Elaine, and she brings up the letter again, which causes him to throw up his hands in frustration. He then goes to practice the sword with Lan, aware that it is an issue for the Aiel that he uses the sword, and he is distracted by Aviendha staring at him throughout the lesson. Lan tells him how the Aiel fight when he asks, and Lan emphasizes the flexibility of their tactics. Rand asks how to beat them, which causes Aviendha to be upset, but Ruark arrives and tells her to stop sulking, assuming that this is all about her giving up the spears to become a wise one. This is when Rand, for the first time, realizes that Aviendha will be a wise one and potentially that she can channel. Ruark offers to teach Rand how to fight the spear, and Rand is exhausted but agrees to do so in order to show his solidarity with the Aiel. As he walks towards Ruark, he jokes with Lan about the weight of duty, who says that it only gets lighter in death. We then switch to Matt's point of view, who tries tries to ignore the training and is sipping Aiel and smoking from a pipe that he bought from the peddler. The ale is apparently too weak for the Aiel, who will only buy hard liquor, but there is a brisk trade going on. Matt is interested in what is going on and the wealth that is happening, but he seems too afraid to kind of dice and figure out basically taking that risk around Aiel. He notes that books and fabrics sell very well, but silk is actually cheaper to the east, and that Aiel smiths are considered much better than the most of the metalwork that is being brought. The Aiel apparently know and like Two Rivers Tabak, but can't find any, and Matt finds himself kind of drifting off into thinking about military strategy. He then thinks he needs to get away from Moraine and looks at his spear, which has two ravens on it. And as he does, he thinks that since he left Roidion, the gaps in his memory have been gone, and instead he has the memory of numerous battles. He seems to remember the old tongue now from those memories. And as he's thinking about this, the gleeman hears him speaking the old tongue to himself and comments on it. He introduces himself as Jasin Natael, who seems kind of overwhelmed by the Aiel. He makes a comment about how strange they are, and Natael seems intrigued by Matt and his familiarity with both the Aiel and Rand, and he seems to kind of note that Matt knows a lot more about what's going on than he lets on. He says that he wants to hear the tale of what happened to Matt when he went into Roidion because he intends to write the story and the song, and he says that he can make Matt the hero. Matt tells the story, although he leaves out anything related to the snakes and the foxes, and he has asked numerous questions and has kind of a number of details pulled out of him by the gleeman, and then Kiel arrives, the rotund woman, and kind of starts arguing with Jasin, saying that they are not here for Roidion, and they argue and kind of wander off. Matt thinks idly that he will try to woo Isendre, but notes that she only has eyes for Rand. The gleeman then begins playing a song about Manetheren and kind of a heroic stand against all odds, which only a small number of people survived from, and Matt thinks he can remember the real events, and it didn't happen exactly the same way, but then he thinks that he remembers dying in that battle, and this may actually be worse than the gaps in his memory that he had before. Suddenly, there are Trollocs and Murdrill everywhere. Matt uses his spear. It's Aes Sedai made, he thinks, and he also thinks that his fox head is pulsing cold at one point during the battle. Eventually, the battle ends. Everyone seems okay. Aviendha apparently found a spear and a shield and put up quite a fight, and the Trollocs apparently targeted Rand and also the Aes Sedai who were with the Wise Ones. Very few of them attacked the Shido. Then Matt observes that the peddler and his people went to hide in the wagons, and Matt thinks that they were cowards for doing so, but he will leave with them if they run. We then jump into Rand's POV. Moraine tells him that he was targeted, and he sarcastically responds that he know. Egwene basically yells at him for trying to make Moraine angry, and Rand thinks that he is exhausted, but at least he knows what Aviendha thinks of him. She hates him. End of chapter. There is a lot there. This feels like the chapter we can dig into a little bit more. What was your kind of favorite moment or biggest takeaway from this? I know it was probably the fight scene, right? It's usually the fight scene with you.
Well, I was going to start with like what a classic example of Robert Jordan wanting to yada 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 away the fight scene, right? Like it happens and there's a body count, a Trolloc body count as the end Aiel, but mostly Trollocs, and it's like it's weird because you're kind of in their heads as it's happening, Matt's head in particular, and it's like he's not even thinking about it. It's it feels like it would be cheesy voiceover over like a slow-mo action scene in a movie or something like that while he's just kind of cutting people down. So a really enjoyable chapter, I think, the better of the two by far in my book, and it sounds like in yours as well. And I guess the main thing I was thinking about is this old question I keep phrasing as who's driving Matt? And I think we get our answer that Matt is much less who he was before, right? I mean, I mean, I'm even tripping over the language because maybe they've merged, or maybe they are maybe it's more the old tongue version that's taking control.
So this is actually where I slightly want to retire the phrase "who's driving Matt."
Yeah, okay,
Not because I don't think it's accurate, but because I think that was something we were really thinking primarily about in terms of the dagger. And is there like a dark influence, or is there something kind of like taking over or replacing Matt? It seems now post his trip through the snakes and foxes, it's less about that because any of that that might have been there is no longer there with the gaps in his memory. And now it seems about like how is Matt himself and also all of these seeming like generals and soldiers that from
Mm.
multiple points in history. And so it's less about who's driving now and it's more about like who is he now, right? Because I don't think there are multiple forces tugging at him. He just fundamentally has different memories than he once did, and we're not sure how much that's changed.
Yeah, I think that is a really helpful Wikipedia disambiguation page to help us remember that it we have I primarily have used that phrase for both of these forces. But I would say I think I'm in agreement with you that this feels like Matt himself has leveled up. And we joked I think last week about the Assassin's Creed video game where you
Yeah.
should kind of come become the master of your ancestry through kind of traveling through your DNA in this weird sci-fi thing. And it feels something more akin to that, which is really interesting because that is not exactly the same, but it's essentially the same as what Rand experienced,
Yeah.
right? He went
Yeah.
back through his ancient bloodline and kind of came to a new set of truths and a new identity with some of that in mind. Whereas I don't think Matt understands it as such, but it does seem that he is now, like you just said, himself plus all the generations that have led to him.
Yeah, and I think the big shift for me that really led to that kind of realization is the difference between occasionally accidentally spouting the old tongue and now remembering enough of past lives to just completely speak the old tongue. And I also think it's very Matt that when he's asked about it, he's just like, "Oh, that's a phrase I once heard. I refuse to acknowledge that I know something." That is like the most Matt thing I've ever heard. I do want to quickly jump back to kind of the first half of this chapter, which I think is less exciting, but there are a couple of interesting notes. The first one that I kind of had down, I don't think we really need to revisit the Avienda Elaine stuff two more times. But I thought the conversation between Ruark and Avienda and Rand about what it means to be Kara Karn and what it means to be chief among the Aiel was really interesting. It's kind of this idea of like first among equals as opposed to a true ruler. And so Rand thinking that these people will just kind of follow him because he is the chief of chiefs, that feels a lot more tenuous after this conversation than it did before. It seems like Avienda kind of has the room to challenge him as much as she wants to, and the only reason that she's getting in any trouble is because she's being petulant about it.
Yeah, and maybe this is where I get a little kind of confused in the politics of it and also in my just shut up. Like I really like and whatever intrigue was there before, but I do think petulant is the right word. And
Yeah,
I my note says this feels so weird. I mean it just feels and we've talked about this before. It's actually good that it often feels kind of high schooly,
yeah.
but it feels very high schooly like don't you dare look at her. You're my friend. Like the text, I saw your boyfriend checking out so and so or something like that. And
Yeah.
it totally makes sense for who these characters are. And yet I don't have a lot of the patience for it. The weird introduction of this like new woman, also in the context of what we just talked about last chapter, it's like, I don't really care, but among the possibilities for what importance she holds, her being a love interest for Rand is so far down the list that I'm just like, calm down, Avienda. Like, just stop being so petulant.
I am absolutely with you, but I do just need to note that a beautiful dark-haired woman entering Rand's life is a thing that has happened a few times before, and it generally doesn't end well. So we at least need to put a small red flag on it, even if we think we might be playing the red herring game here.
Mm. Uh Noted, certainly. And there's a long-standing joke about how there are no blondes in Star Wars, and it's like almost the same thing going on here, where it's like the dark hair woman is a certain type, no matter where we're encountering
I
her.
mean, thus far, it's been the same dark-haired
Right,
woman in
true.
several books. Uh, I think that given that, I don't have a whole lot else until Rand holding Sidene for the entirety of the ride towards Imre Stand. That is something that caught me off guard. He A is able to do it without much thought, which feels like a level up compared to where he was even at the beginning of this book. And B, that almost feels like a level of, if not paranoia, at least like concern for himself. He clearly went to a lot of trouble to be able to be holding Saidin there for what very likely was just a random raid of Aiel. What was your thought on that? It felt like bringing a gun to a knife fight a little bit to me, but maybe I'm underestimating how paranoid he should be.
Yeah, who knows when we're recording, but we're right at the end of the semester, and I have had maybe 10 meetings with students lately about the level of anxiety they are facing as they go into what I would call very simple, straightforward final presentations or
Yeah.
papers. And it's been, it is one of the challenges of teaching. I teach first years, as I think I've said before on the podcast. And it's like this task is so simple if you can set aside that anxiety. And I say
Yeah.
that knowing full well that's not what anxiety is. You
Right.
can't that you cannot approach anxiety rationally, and I'm not demanding the students do that. It just ends up being this form of empathy where I'm like, you got this, you know how to do this thing if you could just do that. And that was a very roundabout way to say, like, this feels like he's just girding himself up against this anxiety more than he is
Yeah.
any specific threat he could be facing. And paranoia, which you just said, was the word in my mind, right? That
Yeah.
he is so guarded that he's going to make a mountain out of a molehill, and that's essentially what it is. Um, and I'll link that to the very end of the chapter where it's it's kind of like, oh, whatever, he's a little on edge, but then you see it's actually causing a huge amount of fatigue, right?
Yeah.
That, like you're saying, it kind of naturally comes to him like he's leveled up, but it has a cost, and
Yeah.
it's not that he can sustain this for a long time. So um to jump back 20 minutes to your question, this is where I start to feel like maybe we're getting some madness, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is a hint that, like, okay, he's not perceiving the world around him in a rational way, and it could have consequences.
If we are then kind of through that section of the chapter, boy, do I love Rand and Lan anytime that we can get those two characters together. I thought that was just a good scene. It was brief. There wasn't a ton to dissect there. I didn't have to read 18 different sword forms with weird names. I liked it. I don't have much else to say about it. What was your thought there?
I like that he has had practice swords just with him all the time. Like,
Yeah.
he's got like the magic cartoon back pocket where he's got whatever he needs. Um, but I thought it was a nice touch. It's so funny because I keep forgetting Lan is here, even
Yeah.
though we just talked about him last week and how he got sat on, which should be pretty memorable and so
Yeah.
on. And then we get to this portion in this chapter. I'm like, oh right, Lan's here. And like I think there's a world in which that could be phrased as a criticism of this, but I don't necessarily feel critical about it. It's just
Yeah.
like I think it's important that we get reminders that he's here, but he doesn't seem to be a major part of what's going on here. I think we're closing in on 2/3 of the way through this book, and it doesn't feel like it's going to be a really big land climax this time around.
Yeah.
But it's not like he got sat in an apartment somewhere to wait till everybody comes back or anything like that.
100%. I am now going to jump to the least important thing in this chapter that I have the biggest star next to. I have one big complaint about the world building of the Wheel of Time, and that is that tobacco is called tabak. And the reason I hate this is because in every single other fantasy series, if they say they're like smoking leaf, that is always code for weed in my head, and it's hilarious to me, right? Gandalf was high the entirety of Lord of the Rings, as far as I'm concerned. And the fact I can't do that here makes me a little bit sad. I have nothing else to say about it. I really enjoyed the people trading goods scene. I felt like it gave you a really kind of good glimpse into the Aiel, but I also have a PhD in economics, so I'm
I
going
was
to
gonna say,
enjoy
spoken
all
like
of the.
spoken like an economist, if I've ever heard that. I say lovingly. Yeah, I mean, these moments are important, just that you get a little bit of the day to day. I mean,
Yeah.
when you're dealing with world changing mythologies and prophecies, it's so easy to lose sight of the fact that these are real entities. I guess they are all humans. I
Yeah.
always hesitate around Aiel, but Aiel are human enough, right? Are
No, they're
humans.
people. Yeah.
Yeah. So to see that kind of simple stature stuff is
Yeah.
good and it's important. And if this is D&D, you need to trade up your goods. You need to go to a town sometimes and get some new gear from the peddlers and so on. So there you
So
go.
you are playing Baldur's Gate 3 right now, which means that you are familiar with Elfira, the character who absolutely 100% should have been a player character and for some reason isn't. Justice for Elfira. That means that we need to honor her by talking about the bard in this chapter. What do you think
Mm.
about Jasin Natael, who could be a player character if Baldur's Gate would just let the bards have one?
It felt like a tangent, but a kind of welcome one,
Yeah.
right? Like it very much is a campfire scene, and those are important to Westerns. Actually, Star Wars has been getting pretty into campfire scenes
Yeah.
lately. And I think it's good, right? Well, and it's the cover of the book, not literally, but like
Yeah.
that's the kind of scene it evokes, and you get a little bit of this. I liked that Robert Jordan had the kind of long story, which, you can kind of skim through and be like, oh, it's just Minotharan stuff or whatever. And then in case you did that, the character was like, and the message is that you shouldn't be so trusting of your
Yeah.
enemies. And Rand says, I don't know if I agree with that message or what have you. I think I got that backwards, but it's like they make it very clear
Yeah.
and it's kind of a nice little moment, but I don't know that I wouldn't call it essential, but I would certainly not cut it out myself.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I think the only other little detail in here that I found really intriguing is it seems like Natail is asking Matt all sorts of questions about Roydian and what he saw there, and he's asking for all these specific details. And then Kiel kind of walks up, and immediately the first thing she says is something like, "We're not here for Roydian," which suggests I don't know, that reads wrong for a group of people who are here just to trade, right?
Hmm.
And so that interaction just set off odd warning bells for me, right? If last chapter we were saying these people seem too good to be evil, I'm at least picking up something odd in that interaction, especially since I don't see any reason why a lady who travels with the peddler and the gleeman should have super close interactions.
Um, and I thought a little bit about the cover story. I think we referred to like 3 weeks ago now about Moraine was collecting stories,
Yeah.
and then Viren used that same excuse, right? Or
Yep.
cover story. And here you have essentially somebody who is a bard, and Tom has actually been collecting stories. So we know that there are people who do this,
Yeah.
but it feels like, oh, I don't trust this as the cover story, although there's something else going on there. That's not
Yeah.
quite right either.
Yeah, I don't have much to add there, but I think you're exactly right in kind of it's a good scene. There's just nothing
Yeah,
to say about it. Welcome to
no.
podcasting sometimes. Um, to that, I guess where I end up is action, action, action. And then there's this really interesting moment right at the end of the chapter where Egwene gets really mad at Rand for making Moraine angry. And I find this interesting because I don't know who's wrong, and I think the answer might be none of them, right?
Mm.
Like Moraine is giving Rand information he already knows. Rand can't trust her and so isn't responding, and they're both frustrated by it, and Egwene is frustrated by them both being frustrated. What's annoying about this is it's that trope we've talked about before where the plot would be a lot easier if everyone was talking, but I don't know who should talk first because they all have such good reasons to not.
Uh, yeah, so there's a funny kind of thing my wife and I always refer to. So when we were watching the television show Friday Night Lights, not when it aired, but sometime on Netflix, we read an interview with Connie Britton, who played Tammy Taylor, and she said their marriage is the best marriage in television because
Accurate.
they are both always right. Like
Mm,
that's what makes a good fake marriage fight, right? Right? Is that they are both right.
yeah.
And it's irreconcilable that they can, in on that show, the conflicts vary a lot, but it's often like whose career do they favor? And like they're both right to argue for their own career, their own positioning. And so when you're describing this moment, it kind of feels like that. Like you
Yeah.
can't fault any of them, but we are kind of at odds. And that is what, why my wife and I refer to this a lot is it's like our litmus test on any fictional couple we're watching in whatever show.
Mm.
It's like if one of them is very clearly like wrong or meant to be portrayed as wrong, then that's a cheat. They
Yeah.
really both have to believe they're right and have the kind of ability to say they're right. So it's one of those moments, and I would say this one passes that test. Like I'm
Yeah.
not upset at any of them, and I think that's what makes it kind of most troubling is those fights are like this could all fall apart, and
Yeah.
it just might.
So I think where I am at then is we have covered most of the big stuff in this chapter, and there's a lot of little stuff we've skipped over because it's itty bitty details. Are there any last things that you wanted to focus on before we talk about next week when we're only covering one chapter because it's a big boy?
Nothing really to add to your summary other than I did like this idea of the spear being a magical weapon, right? Like
Mm.
I think this is our first big clue that
Yeah.
that's not just a spear, but it's endowed with some kind of Aes Sedai power. That's interesting, and I'm excited to see that develop, but I don't have any speculation to say about it. So maybe instead of doing that, I will hide my face and start talking to you about how next week our big boy, chapter 38, is Hidden Faces, and it is just the single chapter we'll be tackling next week. As I just alluded to, I think we passed now we're close. I think next week we'll close in on the 2/3 mark. But we are kind of headed into that part where things start moving very quickly towards the climax of this book. And, it's still, I think, a couple months of this podcast on
Yep.
this book, but it is exciting to, have hit that mark of well past the halfway point. So, Tyler, say something really clever that we all chuckle about, and then through the glass columns.
Oh man, you just said it. Oh, I could have hit stop. I think that for me, this is the section of the book where we've been feeling the podcast the most, right? This would have been a couple of days that instead have been several weeks. But I think we've got some really exciting stuff coming. In particular, the fact that you're going to have to read a decent chunk of the way into the next chapter before we even know who the POV character is and how they are related to the plot of this book. Completely new things are coming next week through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the glass columns.